So this is just the last slide of where we left off last week. Just kind of a reminder of where we want to pick up. Unlike the subject matter of the physical sciences, people have motives, interests, and purposes. They make choices and do things for reasons. They cannot simply be understood as the inevitable product of a given set of conditions. That was under the category, are these diseases, these disorders, biological, which we spent a good bit of time discussing last week. Moving on to the magic pill. Question mark, the magic pill. So, some of you no doubt are here on a steady regimen of mental health medication. And you would say, I don't care where you fall on this spectrum, the medicine works. The medicine works, right? We're not here to argue that. We're not here to debate that. We're not here to prove that or disprove that. Medicine works, okay? So what we know about medicine, one, is that the medicine that is prescribed for a lot of these mental health disorders, they do work. What you would be hard-pressed to find solid ground to stand on is the reasoning behind why they work, how they're effective, what the medication actually does. SSRIs, for instance, are very popular, the most popularly prescribed antidepressant. What it does is it works on the assumption that serotonin is low in the brain, and by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin back into the neurons, what it allows the serotonin to do is to remain active in the brain longer, therefore elevating mood and things like that. That's not guesswork, right? We don't have tests that say we can't observe this process under a microscope. We can observe this process in the brain working, but it doesn't mean that it's a little more than an educated guess, right? It doesn't mean that all we're doing is saying, well, someone who's depressed has, depressive mood. Serotonin helps elevate somebody's mood. Therefore, if the SSRI works, if the antidepressant works, then that's what's happening. That the serotonin is being inhibited, the reuptake of the serotonin is being inhibited, and therefore we have the positive effects of this antidepressant. So, like I said, it's interdisciplinary science, right? There's chemistry, there's psychiatry, there's neurochemistry, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of good ground to stand on for why medicine works the way it does. But unlike hard sciences, chemistry, biology, physics, things like that, this is not an observable process, and it's hard to measure the process because people are subjective, right? Because some people feel better, some people don't. We have different methods of evaluation of how we feel better or not. So we're not saying the medicine doesn't work, and we're not really, I'm not trying to leave you guys questioning about the medication, just understanding that this is one of the fights that psychiatry is in right now is, like we talked about last week, trying to make their home with the hard sciences, but not necessarily having the same evidence and data, hard evidence and data that a lot of the other sciences do. So the medicines work, placebos work too, right? That's studied. For FDA approval process, there has to be a significantly higher outcome or positive outcome of a drug against a placebo. And so that's why there's not a lot of different classifications of antidepressants and anxiety medication has been coming out because they're actually running into problems with the placebo trials, right? And not only that, you say you have 100 people taking a placebo and 35 of those people report positive outcomes on their depressive mood. And you have 100 people taking an active drug and 70 people report having positive result on their depressive mood. What's hard to say is whether those 70 are feeling or having increased or elevated mood or positive results of the trial because of the psychoactive component of the medication, right? We can't say, well, 35 of those 70 may be also feeling or under the sway of the placebo effect. And so placebos work, and there, there's a lot of talk now about the ethical ramifications or consequences of doctors intentionally prescribing placebos. If we know that placebos can be effective without the negative side effects of an antipsychotic, then maybe we just tell them we're prescribing them an active drug. It's just a placebo, and we see if it works. If it doesn't work, then we'll move on to the active drug. Big debate about the ethics of that. So we're not all there. But as far as how the medicine works and the placebos work, the physician desk's reference says this about SSRIs. The mechanism of action of sertraline, or Zoloft, commonly prescribed Zoloft, is presumed to be linked to its inhibition of CNS neuronal uptake of serotonin, right? That's a lot of clinical jargon, but what it's saying is what we're pretty sure is happening is that there is a deficiency of serotonin, so if we block the reuptake of the serotonin, is what we think we're doing, then we'll see positive results. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the medication is doing, but like I said, it's far greater than an educated guess. It's not just, we simply just think that this is what's happening. There's a lot of other sciences converging on the field of psychiatry to help us understand what best is going on. Withdrawals or discontinuation symptoms. This is used as evidence against the efficiency or efficacy of medication because, say, someone with a sleeping disorder is prescribed sleeping medication and they start taking it and it works, and then they stop taking it and then they have a hard time sleeping. A lot of times that can be automatically attributed to, see, I have a sleeping disorder, this is where it comes from, I'm not taking the medication, the disorder has returned. But what we're finding out is that there are withdrawals or discontinuation symptoms associated with sleeping medication, antidepressants. The symptoms of antidepressant withdrawal are depressive symptoms, right? Decreased mood, lowered appetite, poor sleeping habits. So, that's another area where people are fighting against, the efficacy of medication. And one of their arguments is that you stop taking the medication, the disorder returns. What we're finding out is that not necessarily, just like with a lot of medication, you stop taking it, you are going to experience not necessarily the return of a disease or a disorder, but you're going to experience the symptoms of withdrawing or discontinuation from a medication. Okay? Any thoughts or questions, anything so far? All right, and then prescriber privileges. Over recent years, almost 80% of all the mental health medication that has been prescribed in the United States has been prescribed by someone who is not in the psychiatric field. Right? So a general practitioner, a family doctor, those who have prescribing powers for medication but maybe are not necessarily as honed in to the science and to the practice of mental health disorders. And so they're working on that issue, and so when we look at, well, these must be working, prescriptions are on the rise and people are feeling better, we have to understand that people are getting mental health medication from people who are not necessarily, they are in the medical field, but not necessarily in the mental health field. So that's just another thing to consider. And so if you're taking medication, I'm not giving you guys any recommendations, okay? Continue following the recommendation of your prescriber. Don't make any changes without consulting your prescriber, but don't place your hope in a pill. We don't have enough proof for that kind of hope, okay? So historian Ann Harrington writes, make no mistake, today one is hard-pressed to find anyone knowledgeable who believes that the so-called biological revolution of the 1980s made good on most or even any of its therapeutic and scientific promises. And so even those who are in the field, those who are pushing for the advancement of the field, are coming to some hard realizations that over the last 30 years, there hasn't been much in terms of advancements, and there isn't much in terms of how we're dealing on a medical and psychiatric level with mental health disorders. So we're kind of in this rut, and they're doing some fairly radical things to try and jar us out of this rut. But that's kind of where we stand, is on the brink of this biological psychiatric revolution. We were really hopeful, and over the last 30 years, there just hasn't really been a lot that says we've really made good on the promises.
Having said everything you just said, go back to bullet point number 1, medicine's work. Unpack that a little for us. So what is meant by that they work? Even though placebos work, there's withdrawal, discontinuation symptoms, stuff. So what do we mean by medicine's work? What does that mean?
Well, specifically, medicines that work on neurotransmitters like serotonin, norepinephrine, noradrenaline, things like that. We know what those neurotransmitters are responsible for. We know their role in brain chemistry. And so we know that any increase in serotonin, it's reasonable to believe what would result in that would be an elevated mood. Right? We know for anxiety, when you reduce the neuron excitability through GABA, then the protein GABA, you reduce the neuron's abilities to be excited and reactive, then you're not going to be as anxious and have heart rate and high blood pressure and things like that. So generally what we know about medication does seem to ring true. It rings true for those, however, though, who aren't in professional or medical need of them as well, right? So this is a pretty extreme example, but they prescribe in states where medical marijuana is legal. They prescribe medical marijuana for those who are dealing with any type of disease or disorder that includes decreased appetite. Right? They increase, using marijuana is said to have increased somebody's appetite. Well, if you've ever used marijuana without one of those disorders, you've probably experienced something similar, right? Increased appetite. So we know that CNS, central nervous system depressants work, and we know how they work. And so we know when someone's central nervous system is easily excitable or overly excited, we have ways to calm it down. And so that's on a very fundamental level, medicines are working towards that end. We're not able to look at someone's serotonin levels, prescribe them an SSRI, come back and check their serotonin levels and say, we explicitly know there was a deficiency, we explicitly know that this medication targeted that deficiency, and now we know that your levels are back to normal. So which is why there's the reluctancy to call psychiatry a hard science, because of that lacking element. But it doesn't mean that someone who's taking an SRI is not feeling better, having better sleep, increased energy, higher motivation, things like that. Rob.
When you were talking about the prescribers, are you talking about the pharmaceutical companies that are pushing out a new drug and they tell the doctors
these are the things you can use it for, and it's kind of overused by the doctors as a, you could say magic pill, even though they have all these side effects, and there is the possibility for addiction.
Yeah, certainly, and we'll get into that specifically the one right here in a minute. But a lot of times when I'm talking about the prescribers, we're talking about family doctors, general practitioners, OBGYNs, those who deal with a lot of postpartum, disorders, depression disorder, and things like that. So that is not necessarily their field of expertise. They're not completely unaware, and I should say that one of the people I'm working with, or did work with, was in the PA school at Wake, and her first rotation is on the psychiatric ward in a hospital in Raleigh. So they're working, they're understanding that a lot of medical professionals are doing a lot of the prescribing. So instead of taking that power away, they're trying to make them more equipped for the privilege of prescribing mental health medication. Sam.
Some of that.
Yes.
But then you mentioned there have been no advancements in the last 30 years. So you mean no advancements beyond what they already knew? Is that what you're going to
And advancements, Sam was asking, I just remembered I should be repeating the question. Sam asked, brought up the fact that I mentioned there's been no significant advancements in the last 30 years. And what we're talking about in that regard is in classifications in ways to treat these disorders. And so there's a lot of new medication, like even just last year, I think 3 antidepressants received FDA approval. So we're not saying that new medication isn't hitting the market. What we're saying is that SSRIs have been kind of the standard of treating depression from a medicinal standpoint since its FDA approval in the late 80s. April.
Medicines can work, and one of the things over the last 30 years that has happened is as we learn more about the brain and we learn more about medications and genes and how these things work, that yes, there are advancements, but there's also, for every discovery, there's 20 more questions that come along with it. And so as the field continues to grow, more medicines come out to address more nuances within certain aspects of brain chemistry.
Right.
So not every medication is going to have the same effect on every person with the same symptoms.
Right.
So there can be a lot of trial and error in these medications, and one person may respond to one SSRI and have a completely different reaction to another. So it's very fluid, and it's a very trial and error.
Sure. Yeah. No disagreement there. So if it's not biological, it's spiritual, right? Well, hopefully you've not come to expect a hard answer from me already. You know that I'm not going to give you one. And so, because the goal, right, is that we come to the middle, that we stop saying if it's not in this camp, it's in this camp. Because that's not how God created us, that is not who we are and how we respond to our life experiences, to the way our brains and our bodies work. So it's not one or the other. We're talking about the body and soul. I want to read an example, a personal testimony from someone who I talked to in preparation for this. They say, I had an experience recently where I was going through cycles of depression and daily anxiety and panic attacks for several months. I had severe fatigue, difficulty sleeping, intense body pains, random fevers, and other symptoms. While waiting to get in with a holistic doctor, I had a biblical counselor speak to me about how many of my symptoms are likely due to my anxiety, depression, and that for herself, and the implication was that it was also for me, it was related to her relationship with God. This person attempted to counsel me that I needed to surrender more fully to Christ and that I might experience some relief. Her counseling did lead me to examine my relationship with the Lord, and I realized I had been holding on to some bitterness towards Christ about a situation in my life. I reconciled with Christ and surrendered that situation to him. While I did experience spiritual growth, my other symptoms and anxiety, depression were unaffected. I was able to get in with a holistic doctor and was diagnosed with long-term Lyme's disease, mono, and hormonal imbalances. I received treatment. My anxiety and depression struggles have gone from being a daily struggle to maybe every other month. Had I only followed the guidance of someone wanting to address the spiritual aspects, it would have likely become a stumbling block in my relationship with Christ. I would have been left feeling guilty that I'm not good enough or I haven't surrendered enough. Instead of resting in the Lord's grace and using the wisdom and knowledge he has gifted us with in modern treatments to find healing. So a crutch doesn't heal a broken leg, but it can lend some critical support to that leg while it heals. And we want to use all that is available to us, but the process we go through that helps us determine not just if it's available, but whether or not it's right and good, will be determined by asking the right questions, which we'll get into here in a second. So just quickly, history of mental health treatment is pretty crazy. I'm sure some of you guys have heard some of that, but early on, it was considered spiritual, right? Whether it be witchcraft, demonic possession, people making deals with the devil, people making their gods angry, or medical, right? We have this out of balance in the early 1600s from Thomas Willis. We have this out of balance idea or theory. So his approach to healing was bleeding, purging, and vomiting to help balance those chemicals, right? So if there was an excess of these chemicals, then if you could just literally get rid of some bodily fluid, then you would put those chemicals back in balance. Thankfully, we don't still operate that way. In the 30s and 60s, one approach to mental health treatment was inducing comas with insulin because it was believed to alter brain wiring. We have metrazole therapy, believed that conditions that cause seizures could not coexist with mental illness. So seizures were induced to reduce mental illness. So if you couldn't have both at the same time, then induce seizures, and that would, kind of kick out the mental illness. And then, of course, lobotomies, which are still legal. They're just very rarely used, but they're used to sever nerve pathways in the prefrontal lobe, not necessarily to return patients to a state of sanity, but really just to a state of calmness. But although it did reduce psychotic symptoms, there are other side effects like apathy, lack of initiative, poor ability to concentrate, and a generally decreased depth and intensity of their emotional response to life. Pretty much everything you would expect when your prefrontal lobe is disconnected to the rest of your brain. So what we want to do is deal with the whole person, and in 1977, the biopsychosocial model was introduced, and what that was, we'll go over here in a second, but really that was the first approach or attempt at dealing with the person holistically, the whole person. And so even though the field is making stride towards the treatment of the whole person, there's definitely still some work to be done. The current civil war in the field of psychiatry versus psychology is that there are efforts to combine and work together while each having influence on the other, but the efforts of those working from the psychiatric or the medicinal field are really working to emphasize the need for treatment to get rid of or even prevent the disorder versus the other half of the treatment field that says that we're going to work through these issues and deal with the symptoms as they come up. Hippocrates said it is more important to know what sort of person has the disease than to know what sort of disease a person has. And so this mindset has been around for a long time as far as the type of person, the person's life experiences, their upbringing, their current environment. Those things matter in mental health as well, and physical health. So are there any comments, questions? All right. We'll get through this last part and we'll slow down a little bit. Biological, so I mentioned the biopsychosocial model. Still pretty prevalent today, and what it really means is just we are looking at the entire person. So we're looking at their biology, the genetics, the brain chemistry, any potential brain damage. We're also looking at the psychological side, which would be the way that you think, how you interpret events, how you respond, your core values and your core beliefs. Looking at the social aspect of your lives, your environment, early life experiences, family relationships, upbringing, trauma, things like that. And so if you guys remember back when we went over some of the DSM-5 criteria for diagnosing last week, a lot of the criteria had to meet what is called clinically significant distress or disturbance in these three realms. So when you have a disorder, it has to significantly disrupt these three areas of your life if you are going to meet criteria for being diagnosed with a mental health disorder. We have one pretty prominent example of this now. You know, some agree, some disagree, what's called medication-assisted treatment. This is used in recovery, addiction recovery. And what this is if you are addicted to opioids, you can go to a methadone or a Suboxone clinic, and you can receive an opiate, a pill. If you're further along in the process, sometimes you can get a monthly injection. But the idea is that there are a lot of components besides just, you know, the chemical reaction in your brain to the presence or the absence of the opioid. And so if we can remove that as one of the conflicting factors to why your life is the way it is, ideally on this treatment, you would also receive counseling to traditionally talk therapy to discuss values and morals and decision making and your reactions to things. And then you would also receive a caseworker, someone who would help you make sure you have transportation, someone who would make sure that you have job interviews and that you're dressed well for your job interview and you are able to shave and get a haircut and things like that, right? So the approach here is that the medication is one facet of what is creating the difficulty or the disturbance in someone's life. And addressing it just from one point is fairly ineffective. From the standpoint of consumers and patients, it is very attractive on different levels to take a pill to solve our problems. But we haven't gotten to a point where a pill alone can resolve most people's depression or anxiety. That is from Daniel Carlott. He is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Tufts University. So Tufts University is one of the top, if not the top, research university in the United States. And this is their professor of clinical psychiatry. And even he is laying out there boldly and simply, we're not there yet. We don't have a pill that fixes everything that people are dealing with because there's so much on the human side, the spiritual side, the soul side of our mental health struggles that go unaddressed, that can't be addressed from a medicinal standpoint, okay? Alan Francis, we mentioned him last week. He was the editor of the 3rd edition of the DSM. He says, drugs don't cure schizophrenia, and they usually don't work at all for a person with a mental health disorder if that person doesn't have a place to live and an adequate support system. Psychiatry places a bad bet for itself and for its patients if it expects quick biological breakthroughs and tamely accepts a restricted role as a pill prescriber. And so what we have is people in the field understanding that in something like this, there are people that will be as bold as to say, we will never have a pill that solves these problems, right? Because, I mean, even just like April mentioned, the way people respond to the same pill, according to there have been studies that show that if you expect the pill to work, it will work better than if you don't expect the pill to work. And so, right, so there's not going to be a pill, I don't want to go on the record saying that, but I'm not altogether sure. I would side with those who would say there's not going to be a pill that is going to solve people's problems, because we don't all respond the same way, and we still haven't pinpointed. What that would require is that we pinpoint precisely what it is people are struggling with in their mental health, and it would have to prove that mental health struggles are purely biological. And there are many still fighting from that standpoint, but it's pretty overwhelmingly stated and proven and adhered to that we need to address the whole person. And so when I say we need to become a community, a family equipped for dealing with people and their mental health struggles, it's not necessarily being their psychologist or their psychiatrist, right? It can be working as their case manager. Can you help them with rides? Can you help them fill out job applications? Can you help them update their resume? Can you help them find an apartment or apply for disability or whatever? Working as somewhat as their caseworker, or discipling and walking with them and talking through what it is that they're anxious about, that why they're feeling depressed, and what types of events and experiences may have brought that up. So when I say we can become better equipped and we can become a better environment for people struggling in this way, I mean on that side. I don't mean on everyone's ability to read up on current clinical trials of antidepressants, okay? So are there any thoughts or questions so far? So.
Would you have to address the whole person? Are you saying that medication is an important part of addressing the whole person?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. Mental health struggle or challenge does not necessitate medication, right? But there are definitely, I've worked with many people. I worked with someone who, well, I'll save that example in a minute. But yeah, it's just a part of it, is that when I say medication is an equal part of it, I mean ruling it out or ruling it in. Not you have to take medication if you're going to treat or deal with this mental health struggle. Is that your question? Kind of? All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
It's usually either or, though. In just helping people through the process, I found that the church generally thinks medicine's evil, and science usually believes it's the cure.
Yeah.
So they're like extreme opposites. It's hard to find middle ground.
And that's why we're doing this series. That's exactly right. And, I think people are coming around to a more balanced view, right? And just understanding that we are complex. Our body, our physical body affects at times how we think and how we feel. And of course, how the things that we may be afraid of or anxious about or worried about can produce and influence physical responses as well. So yeah, we have to be able to address the issue without ruling out one or the other, at least not as prematurely as historically we've done. Russ.
Just another way to think about this is some of these churches that would say, well, you can't take medicine for mental issues, would also say, I can't function until I've had my second cup of coffee. And that's literally the same thing as medicine. Because you're taking in a substance to augment your physical condition at the moment. And, well, let's use medicine. Medicine can include your diet, it can include sunshine, it can include physical exercise. As much as we could talk, and again, I'm not any kind of amateur psychologist, I'm just a guy who deals with some junk. As much as we talk about, well, what are these factors? They can be genetic, it can be social, it can be biological, it can be all these things, it can be spiritual. We live in a metaphorical ocean of factors as well, and all those different factors are affecting. Oh, well, let me take this medicine. Why am I taking the same sleep medicine so long? Because I haven't personally had 8 hours of sleep without medication since, I think, 2006. So, well, what about diet? What about doing these things? Those things haven't worked for me. As much as well, let me work really hard and I'll be super exhausted and then I'll lay my head on the pillow and I'll get a good night's sleep. It doesn't work for me. That's just me. So I need some sort of augmentation to help me just be able to sleep. So I think another way to think about this is not thinking of it as in terms of, oh, it's a medicine, which is essentially the same as a drug. I mean, maybe we think about it instead of it's medicine, which is essentially the same as a specifically tailored food dish that's going to give me the specific nutrients and things that I need to help adjust me a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate that perspective, and we just typically try and stay away from any perspective that would put a negative spin on coffee. So just don't. But no. But you're absolutely right. You know, Jordan Peterson, a clinical psychologist in the University of Toronto up in Canada, he says, do you know how many people I've seen cured from major depressive disorder with a better diet and regular exercise in the morning, going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time? Just with an enhanced routine, he's seen people with major depressive disorder experience symptom relief, who he himself, if you guys are familiar with his journey at all, he just had a terrible bout of mental health with some benzodiazepines that he was taking for anxiety, that he got addicted to, that he kind of quit cold turkey, and as he explains it, ended up in a Russian emergency room. So, yeah, so he is very familiar with the idea of understanding what is going to work best for what people, and not using blanket statements like, or having blanket answers for do we use medicine or not. It depends, right? We can't have a blanket approach. It takes wisdom and discernment. Right? If I'm working with someone who is experiencing depressive symptoms, and as a result, they haven't slept in 5 days and they haven't eaten in 5 days, and coming in for a counseling appointment was the first time they've left the house in 2 weeks, right? We want to address and stabilize some of those physical factors first, because there's no way you can expect them to do the hard work of reflection and introspection and hard thinking about themselves and their experiences if they're sleep deprived and they haven't eaten, right? And so we don't want to fall too hard on one line or the other, or say, well, just, you know, you're coming in with these symptoms, go see a psychiatrist, and, you know, that should, you know, I think the reason you're feeling this way is because you haven't slept and you haven't eaten, so as long as you get that squared away, then, you know, there's not really much else to talk about. So you can see the danger from, you know, going one side or the other too far. We don't want to do that. I've heard it explained or illustrated. It's like working on renovating a second floor of a house that has missing floorboards. And you can go to work on renovating that second floor and stepping carefully and making sure you're stepping where there are floorboards, and doing the work that way. Or you can start by laying some more floorboards and then, you know, making sure that you have sure footing more often than not. So I thought that was a pretty helpful illustration. Like we said, a crutch doesn't heal a broken leg, but it does provide some critical help and support. So instead of asking, do we use medicine or not, we ask these questions: what do we want the medication to do? Right? Do we want the medication to reduce the symptoms? Do we want medication to cure the problem? Rebecca Brockman, she's a PhD in neuroscience and a scientist working in the field of preventative psychopharmacology, so drugs to prevent mental illness. Her work out of Columbia University is focused on stress resilience, which is basically the ability of your body to bounce back after a stressful situation. and they've been doing this test on mice for years now. What they've done is they've given these mice antidepressant treatments and then introduced stressful, whether it be biological stressful hormones or stress-inducing hormones or sociological, stressful environmental factors. They introduce these mice to stressful conditions for 3 weeks. And the antidepressants taken beforehand have no effect on whether or not the mice react as if they were reacting to stressful situations. What they found out when they've given the mice what they call resiliency boosters before they introduce the stressful situation, the mice carry on as if they have not experienced anything stressful or adverse. So you might think, wow, that's great, and maybe you don't think that. I have a lot of questions for sure, but they say that this is the first time in medical history that a medicine has been shown to prevent the negative effects of stress. So this is still in mice trials. They're not working on humans yet, but you consider the potential consequences of being able to go through life without ever feeling the effects of stress. I don't necessarily think that's a great thing, but.
Yeah, I was just going to comment, of course, the mice didn't just lose their job and still have to pay a mortgage.
Yeah.
I mean, things like that, it's like, oh, well, look, there's these biological effects we can see. I think that just adds to the argument of this very muddy water complexity of what are we dealing with. It's like, oh, look, we tried this on chimpanzees, which biologically are close to humans. Look, it has this effect. Yeah, they're not thinking about, I'm going to ask this girl to marry me. What if she says no? Blah, blah. I mean, right? There's not those other stressors that we can relate to humanity.
So, specifically, another concern about it, and not necessarily just the moral or the ethical consequences, but the drug that they're using is ketamine, and it's typically known for a tranquilizer or a sedative. It's also very commonly known as Special K, which is a very, very strong, powerful club drug, party drug. What's interesting is that they're using this already as an antidepressant, not preventatively, but as an antidepressant after depressive episodes. And one of the side effects is that you trip, right, for about 20 to 40 minutes, even in a professionally, medically monitored environment with a professionally, medically curated dosage. It doesn't take away the fact, it doesn't take away the party drug element of the chemical. So you still experience a trip as you're trying to decrease the symptoms of antidepressants. So some people like it, some people don't like it, but that's where we're giving everything a shot these days. So what do we want the medication to do? Why do we want the medication to do that? Do we want to cure the problem? Do we want to find relief for the symptoms so that we can address matters that we know cognitively that we have to address? Or do we just want medicine to do the hard work for us? And unfortunately, that's one of the, some call the negative consequences of the field of psychiatry advancing towards finding a pill that cures our problems, is that they're making more money prescribing the pill. They're spending far less time with individuals, and they themselves are losing the skill of counseling and psychotherapy. So they're becoming less comfortable and honestly less practiced in the field of counseling and addressing people's needs other than prescribing some medication. And so it's kind of influencing itself in potentially a negative direction, because we don't necessarily want a pill to just fix all of our problems. And the reason we don't want that is because we have to ask ourselves, what does God want to do with our suffering? Right? We understand that suffering is a necessary part of life. And we know the Bible talks about suffering a lot, oftentimes generally without specifying medical suffering or spiritual suffering or mental suffering. Just suffering, trials, adversity, spoken of generally, to include and incorporate everything we experience in life. And so if the Bible talks that much about it, we know it's important. We know that God intends to do something with it. C.S. Lewis said we can even ignore pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. Right? The next sentence is the more commonly known one. God speaks to us, or whispers to us in our joy, speaks to us in our conscience, and shouts at us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to a deaf world. More people are familiar with that one, but this is the preceding sentence. We can ignore pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. And so we ask the question, what are we feeling? Why are we feeling this way? And what does God intend to do with it? What does God intend to do with us as we experience this? So we know the end of suffering is a hallmark of the new creation. So we know God does intend to one day end suffering, end pain, end these trials, these challenges, these obstacles we face, whether they be our own sinfulness or consequences of someone else's sinfulness or just consequences of a broken world. We know God does intend and promise to put that to bed one day. But because he has not, we still have to ask this question, what does God want to do with it? What does God intend to use it for in our lives individually? So instead of asking the question, should I take medication, ask harder questions. What is it I want the medication to do? Why do I want the medication to do that? And does that line up with what God intends to do, what God has stated he desires to do with my challenges and with my trials and with my adversities? Anything else? Yeah.
But I think that just bolsters the camp that says you don't need medication or any of that because God is able to do anything in your life, right? So if you look at it as what does God want to do with your suffering, then, because I've known and you've known people too that have said it's a spiritual matter, right? And so if you take that first bullet right there are people who would argue that would say then medication is not an option because you'd be interfering in with what God wants to do with your suffering, right? And so it's, this is, you sit here and you go, man, what's the right answer? And you need to give it to us.
and so that's why I brought up the point that God one day does intend to end all suffering. So we know that it's not completely out of the realm of God's desire and intended purpose for, history, right? One day he will end all suffering. And it doesn't necessarily mean that just because he hasn't ended all suffering for all people now, that's not a worthwhile pursuit, right? But when we say is it biological or is it spiritual, we have we can dichotomize to the point where if we believe it's purely biological and you leave out the spiritual side, that you can't leave out the spiritual side because no matter what it is you're facing, whether it's clinically diagnosable, your response to it is the part that God plans on attending to, right? God wants you to attend to. So whether it's major depressive, whether it's anxiety, the trouble or this word is just nowhere to be found. Potentially problematic consequence of pursuing medication first is really this idea that we don't want to put the work in to attend to how this is affecting our relationships or how this is affecting our work or how this is affecting my thought life. And we just would assume that all of these things are being affected negatively as we are victimized by our disorder. And so if we can stop the victimization, then our relationships would improve, our our prayer life and our Bible reading would improve. All those things that we are responsible for attending to are there regardless of whether or not you take medication and whether or not the medication works. And so those are the types of things we want to address. 1 second, Russ.
So this is in no way to down medication, okay? But in the field of psychiatry, you know, there's a secular mindset that says that the body is a glorified machine. Mm-hmm. So something's not working, so if we fix that, it'll put everything whole again. Mm-hmm. And so if you go to a psychiatrist with a presenting issue, you're probably going to leave with a prescription. So my question to you is, as a church body, and as you work with people, is there a psychiatrist or a psychiatrist in this area that would have a Christian mindset about psychiatry that you can refer people to?
Yes. Yeah, there is. And if you can, and yeah, if you want to know more about that, if anyone wants to know more about that, you can definitely come to me and we can make that connection. But yes, there is.
Yes. To kind of spare you from the question, which is a good question because it's overwhelming. It's like, well, what's the right answer? You got to tell us, Chris. Well, I think we have to realize there's 3 levels of this. The first level
we got time for 3 levels?
Yes, quickly.
Okay.
The first level is, what am I dealing with? And how do I need to get fixing for this? Maybe I need medication because I'm dealing with some stuff. Yeah. At your level, in the middle, at the top, is, hey, I'm going to sit down with you. We're going to have counseling for the next couple of weeks. And we're going to blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. But we're in the middle. And I think the biggest answer for us in the middle is be willing to hear awkward, uncomfortable, and hard statements from a person and be willing to ask hard questions. Oh, I'm just dealing with this thing. Why do you think that is? And don't just give me some tough answer. Let's think about this. I don't know the answers, but I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to talk. We're not just going to write it off as a spiritual thing. It could be more complex, but we're just going to talk about it and aim towards the...
Yeah. Absolutely. That is definitely the work of discipleship and you know, the body as a whole. And so what we want to do is, I just want to reiterate, we want to address the issues that are the moral, ethical, spiritual issues in any of our challenges, whether they be physical ailments, right? We know people with chronic pain disease, and they don't get to be grumpy, you know, unfriendly, just curmudgeons because they're chronically feeling pain. That might be the tendency, and it's honestly seems reasonable, right? But do we get to allow those types of experiences to dictate who we are supposed to be in Christ, right? Do we allow those to put aside the commandments to love God and to love one another, to consider others more important than ourselves, to bear one another's burdens, you know, all the one another's, right? Those, we don't get a pass from those because we struggle with something physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. We understand because of the way the body and the brain and the soul work together, there are some conditions and disorders that make it much more difficult. And that just unfortunately means for you that it takes much more work and it takes a lot harder work, but it also means that you have the potential to experience that much more growth, right? And so that's why I say to people that I'm working with, that whatever their situation or challenge is, that you have the opportunity to be not just back to where you were before you came to counseling or before you started feeling depressed, right? Now you have the potential to grow into a person that is much better equipped to deal with the next situation, the next challenge, the next obstacle. So, you know, and that is whether or not this is diagnosable or not. We still have the opportunity, if we approach it the right way, to grow into people who understands what it means to walk with God despite the circumstances, right? In all of our trials, and what it means to consider it all joy, and what it means to be patient and to learn patience and things like that. The important question is not, like I said, do we take medicine or do we not take medicine? Is medicine good or is medicine bad? Those are polarizing questions, and they really undermine the real issues at hand. What does God want to do? What is God's intended purpose? And where do you fall in accordance with what God has stated his will is for us as we live here on earth? Carla.
Is one of the most important things for us to do is have consistency in how we as a church, how we as believers approach a situation, a mental health situation, the same way we would approach somebody in the hospital with a broken leg, in the sense of you would ask that question of both of those people. I think often we think of, when we have someone who is experiencing a physical malady of some kind, we take them a meal, we go visit them, we have this list of things that we can do to help those people, and sometimes I think we may not apply those same things, whereas the person struggling with a mental health issue might really benefit from somebody taking them a meal and going to visit them. And, coming up, if some things, if they're struggling with mental health and hey, I could go help them with a household task, that might help them feel less overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a void. I feel like we don't do the things for mental health challenges that we might do for physical ones.
Yeah.
Would help.
And one thing that would help that consistency is openness and transparency, right? And so I'm not afraid to tell you guys if I broke my leg, because now I got to admit that I got a calcium deficiency and I got weak bones, right? That necessarily wouldn't be embarrassing for me to say. If that's the case, that's the case. I'll take the meal. But now if that's just, let's be honest. But if I got to admit that cognitively or emotionally, I have a hard time dealing with my kids at home or the stress at work, right? Things that it's just assumed I should be able to handle, then, no one, like when the Carmichaels get hurt, with their trees, no one expects them to not get hurt if a chainsaw starts swinging from a tree, you know what I mean? But people, for some reason, we do have this understanding, this presupposition that those types of tasks we should be equipped to do, and if we're not, then that's kind of embarrassing or shameful, and that's what helps create the reluctancy to talk about those things. But if we were talking about those things, and if someone who struggled with anxiety because of the overwhelming environment at home received help at home, I think that would be awesome.
Eventually, the person that is dealing with mental illness just needs someone to come alongside, support them, love them, work with them, mentor them through legal reform.
And how, and consider the consequences that could be increased by, struggling with something and then just kind of resigning that you're just going to have to struggle by yourself. You're not going to let anyone in to help bear this burden with you. That really exponentially increases feelings of anxiety and overwhelming. I'm going to go Bessie first.
So that brings us to how we as a church can better help those in need. Things like this, we don't broadcast it. We're not going to get up front and announce it. Necessarily don't put an email out. But how can we help? And there may be somebody who they themselves are not dealing with a mental health issue, but they have a family member that they are responsible for. And that's heavy load on them. And nobody else may really know them. One or two people may know that person might benefit from us taking it. Or other things. But then how are we going to, work
Yeah. I had to chuckle a little bit because we do send out a church-wide email about someone who's having surgery or someone who fell down the stairs, but we're not going to say, hey, church, we want you to be aware that Wade is really struggling with anxiety, and I'm not saying that that's what the type of community we want to aspire to, is that we're sending out emails for that necessarily, right? There's still still should be some hesitation to go that far. But yeah, you'd be surprised. Yeah, I'd say you'd be surprised that of 10 of your closest friends, there may be someone there who's struggling or who's seeing a counselor or who's been taking, medication, and you'd be surprised because you thought you knew them, you thought you guys were open about each other's lives. But that's just one area of our lives that even for sometimes people closest to us, that's just a corner that remains tucked away, and it makes it difficult. So we do want to work on that. April, and then we'll finish up.
His question, and something that's helped me as a parent who medicates their child, 2 illustrations that are very commonly used are that of diabetes and glasses. If someone has type 1 diabetes, they have to have insulin to live. We wouldn't deny them insulin. Or if you can't see the board, you put on the glasses. Nobody's looking at these people wearing glasses and saying, well, that person has a spiritual problem. And yet we do that when there's things in our brains that aren't working the right way that could possibly be helping with medication. And giving them that ability to pursue that angle can be very supportive.
Good. Okay, good. We're a bit over time, so we'll call it there, and we'll pray, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to discuss these matters. Thank you that you have given us the ability to think through and to make ourselves aware individually and as a family about these issues, to be more open to those struggling with these issues, God. We pray ultimately that the result of these 4 weeks is that we are more closely aligned in our understanding of what it is you intend for us and what you have determined is your will for us as we live here on earth. God, we know that there are obstacles and there are challenges that are presented along the way, but it is always our responsibility to look to you and to ask what it is that you would require of us in any of these situations. So God, as we continue to discuss through this, as we think through this, even as we go on our separate ways now, Lord, I just pray that you would help guide our thinking in a way that looks to you for ultimate wisdom, but in a way that also considers being compassionate and understanding and patient with those around us. We love you, God, and it's your Son's name we pray. Amen.